She joins me now from San Francisco to discuss the conflict between Palestine and Israel. You know, I love this show because I really get the opportunity to get history taught to me again with things that were never discussed, even when I went back to school. We didn't discuss things like this, so you should bring the kids in to watch this show. Alison, you first traveled to Palestine territories during the Second War to independently cover the conflict. Can you first give me a brief history lesson on the conflict and where it stands today?
I'd be happy to, because as you point out, most of us don't know that. I had no idea about this 18 years ago. When I was born, it turns out, and I suspect you're about the same age, when I was born, there was no Israel. There was a region called Palestine that at that time was under the British Empire. It was largely, the conflict did not originate from the region. Some people are led to believe by media coverage and I suppose by movies, etc., that this conflict has been going on for thousands of years, people will say. It's not true. When you look back at the historic record, you see in the late 1800s, Palestine was inhabited by about 80% Muslims, about 15% Christians, that's where Christianity began after all, and about 5% Jews, without conflict. There are ancient churches there, there are ancient temples, etc. What happened is that there was a political movement that began in Europe and very quickly in the United States in the late 1800s that had the goal of pushing out those inhabitants, 95% of them, in order to create a Jewish state. They eventually succeeded in doing that. In 1948, Israel was created through a massive war that an Israeli historian has accurately called a war of ethnic cleansing. That's what this conflict is about.
Now, while you were on the ground, who did you talk to and what did you discover there?
I was there in early 2001. This is a period, it was the second major uprising by the Palestinians against the occupation and against the Israeli oppression that they were living under. So I went over there as a freelance reporter. I had known very little about the issue. I always tilted towards Israel. I had seen Exodus with Paul Newman, and I was very sympathetic to Israel. But during this uprising, I began to look into it as a journalist, and online I was very disturbed at what I thought seemed to be going on. So I traveled over there as a freelance independent reporter. I spoke to everybody I could. I traveled randomly and haphazardly throughout Gaza, throughout the West Bank, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jenin, Gaza City, Rafah, and I talked to everyone. I talked to farmers, teachers, students, professionals, people of low income, and what I saw firsthand was enormous violence against a largely unarmed population, both Christians and Muslims. I saw children who had been shot. A lot of children had been shot. You could, in hospitals in Gaza, I saw small boys who'd been shot in the chest, in the teeth, in the head. I saw a brain-dead little boy. I saw entire neighborhoods that already, this was early 2001, February and March, I saw entire neighborhoods that were destroyed. They looked to me like pictures I had seen of World War II. And it's important to remember that this was before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. This is what was going on there. It was pretty horrendous, a pretty intense trip.
Now, based on that experience of being there and the death and destruction you saw there on the ground, are American media outlets fairly covering this conflict, or are they one-sided?
The coverage is, with a few exceptions, very few exceptions, very one-sided. We're getting, at minimum, Israel-centric reporting in terms of what they put in and what they leave out, especially what they leave out, and the spin that we get. And I'm talking about both the liberal media and the conservative media. We are getting we are getting reporting that has Israel spin in it. We've done a number of studies, statistical studies on coverage. My son is a scientist. I like to learn factual information. So we looked into how media had covered deaths among both populations, clearly an important category and a quantifiable category. And we found, for example, that primetime network news, CBS, NBC, ABC, were reporting on Israeli children's deaths at rates 13 and 14 times greater than they were reporting on Palestinian children's deaths. In other words, when a Palestinian child is killed, which is happening fairly frequently over the past 20 years, this is quite common. The media almost never report on it. It's just not considered newsworthy, I suppose. When an Israeli child is tragically killed, that's headlines. We hear about that. So Americans are getting very filtered coverage, very filtered coverage. We always hear about the rockets from Gaza.
Now,
we never hear that the rockets came after the violence against people in Gaza.
Yeah, we sure didn't. Anyway, you started an organization called If Americans Knew. What do you want Americans to know about Palestine and Israel, and what aren't they being told about them?
Well, I think one thing that I think it's essential that we learn is that we as Americans are very much a part of this conflict. I always thought it was Israel-Palestine and had really nothing to do with me. I think many people think that. I don't happen to be Jewish, and I didn't think I had any connection to this conflict. Most of us feel that way, I suspect. But in reality, the U.S., our politicians from both parties, are giving Israel massive amounts of money, over $10 million per day. We have given Israel, tiny Israel, far more of our tax money than anywhere else. This makes us responsible for what Israel does. And the rest of the world knows that, especially in the Middle East, but other parts of the world too are quite aware that Americans are funding Israeli actions. And they are often also very aware that Israeli actions are quite often violent. They have violated human rights. This is well documented, violated international law, even violated U.S. laws. So I think it's very important for us to know that we're part of this issue, and therefore we need to learn independently the real facts about Israel-Palestine. And we're not getting that from our mainstream media, neither from the liberal nor from the conservative media.
Now, your book is about how the U.S. was used to create Israel. Can you explain the roots of the alliance and that creation?
I'll be happy to. The first thing I want to note is it's not really an alliance. An alliance means that both parties benefit in some manner, that there's some sort of two-way street here. But really, it's Israel that benefits. They get U.S. money, massive amounts of money. They get U.S. weaponry. They get wonderful trade agreements and preferential treatment. They get cover in the international community by the U.S. They've gotten some wars. We invaded Iraq largely for Israel. So they've gotten a great deal from the U.S. We've gotten very little. We get hostility. We lose money from our economy. Often there are subsidies to Israel that hurt that cause job loss in the United States. So it's not really what you would call an alliance. But it was forged early on by a very powerful and very pervasive lobby on behalf of Israel, pushing this in the American society, using various types of efforts to create this situation in which the U.S. government would support Israel no matter what Israel does, and that most of the American population would be unaware of any of this.
And this is all the result of the powerful Israel lobby to our congressmen and our senators, correct? They spend a great deal of money lobbying our elected officials, correct?
That's correct. That's exactly what's been going on for many decades. I should point out that at the beginning, when this lobby became active, before to create Israel, our experts in the State Department, in the Pentagon, in the intelligence agencies back, decades ago under Truman and before, were recommending against supporting Israel because it would be detrimental to the United States. There were numerous studies and memos and reports all saying that this would be bad for the U.S. These were coming out of the Pentagon, the State Department, etc. But what we had then and what we have now are individuals and groups that organize huge campaign donations to our politicians from both parties that they will give to those politicians if they toe the line on Israel. And if they don't toe the line, then that money will go to their opponents. This is widely known in Washington, D.C. This is how it works. This is what's going on right now. When you look into it, it's quite blatant. There are numerous political action committees with somewhat deceptive names that give money to Israel, and billionaires like Haim Saban and Sheldon Adelson that are giving to our candidates on condition that the candidates support Israel, no matter what Israel does.
It goes to show you that the system of bribery is so alive and well that the Democrats and Republicans have created. Now, how does America's cozy relationship with Israel affect the geopolitics in the Middle East? What happens because of this?
It's disastrous. It's a tragic result. We've seen numerous wars. We've seen Iraq destroyed, then that has destabilized. Then the refugees have gone to Syria. It's caused the rise of extremism, of violence throughout the region. It's destabilizing entire countries. Then we have a refugee crisis in which refugees are fleeing the violence and going to Europe, causing disruption in Europe and elsewhere, all very much rooted in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And this is not unintended. I've been studying this now for 18 years. And Israel, from its earliest days, Ben-Gurion in the 1950s, was writing about their strategy. After all, they had dispossessed an entire population in the middle of the Middle East. So their strategy was they had to prevent any of the surrounding countries that naturally would support the rights of the refugees to return home. They had to prevent any of those surrounding countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, other countries, from becoming successful enough to challenge Israel. So they either push through policies in the U.S. in which our tax money would be used to buy off Egypt and Jordan, and that's what was done. They both get lots of U.S. tax money too. And in other cases, they've helped create wars and violence in places like Lebanon. They've invaded Lebanon at least twice, 2 major invasions, other smaller ones. They now have the U.S., our hostility towards Iran is very much being pushed by Israel and the Israel lobby. It's created instability and tragic in the Middle East, and that is dangerous for the entire world.
Alison, I hate to stop us, but we'll run out of time. I want to thank you very much, very, very much, for this phenomenal history lesson on the world according to Jesse. Thank you.